and also its demise quietly.
Completely overwhelmed. They did not really band together.
If we hadn't suppressed comic books, we wouldn't have gone to Vietnam.
No, if we
books?
hadn't suppressed comic books, we wouldn't have this fuck ton of superhero movies gobbling up all the funding.
Was there comic books in Vietnam? Did you see them?
I never saw a comic book.
Probably not. I mean, they've been crushed by that. There were lots of comic books in World War II.
Right.
They shipped them out all the time, but I think after that...
I don't think that... We had books.
Nobody gave a crap after that.
They had tons of books.
The only
that they shipped
comics
over,
in Vietnam are probably in the Playboy.
No, Fritz the Cat.
Fritz the Cat.
What was he in? Esquire? Playboy? I can't remember.
Fritz the Cat. Well, that was our Crumb, but...
No, that wasn't.
Yes, it
was our Crumb Fritz the Cat?
Yeah, that was Fritz the Cat. It's really weird to get your head around what it was. I mean, it was so artistically devastating, and nobody knows about it. You know? And they were really demonized. I mean, it's such a role. I mean, like Stan Lee he couldn't tell people what he did.
Yeah, back in the 40s and in the 50s, you really did not want to advertise that you were
associated
in any way with comics.
Can you believe that? The guy who created Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and X-Men and all this stuff couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
It seems so insane now, doesn't it? It's like it's absolutely nuts.
What's I think hard about it, for me anyways, is a lot of movements you can trace back to, it was a like communism's, we're against that, so anything that related to that, or it's a religious aspect. This seems to be just so, like, I don't know, out of thin air.
Well, there were several movements. What was I reading? I was reading something about it. I can't remember where I read it from. I think it was from Alter Ego magazine. But there had been several attempts in the late 40s, even in the earlier in the early 50s, to try to ban these things or do something about it, and they never succeeded. I think there was even an earlier attempt to form some sort of coalition for self-censorship and all those things. Like, they actually formed some sort of thing, but it was just kind of like nudge, nudge.
Well, that was in the 30s, right before the war, right?
No. I'm talking about after the war in the 40s. There was some stuff. There was some problems with the pulp magazines and stuff. But no, there was some actual movements. But the comics were too popular, and it didn't reach the cultural zeitgeist. And I think a lot of it was. Let's break it down. I think a lot of it was there was people who wanted an issue to take advantage of it. They wanted, for Wortham, it was some notoriety and some twisted idea about helping kids. There was politicians like Eustace Kefauver who wanted to make a name for themselves. Other people got on the bandwagon because they wanted to crush comics because they want kids to read their children's books that they were writing. And then there were religious folks who were always looking for something to rile people up. And the biggest thing is, it was comics. It was kids. There wasn't anyone to defend it. There wasn't anyone to stand up and say this is wrong. Whereas rock and roll was just so pervasive. Like, I mean, there were counter protests and stuff like that for the anti-rock and roll thing, wasn't there? I mean, there were radio people who would get on the radio and said, "I'm going to keep playing rock and roll because that's what the kids want," and blah blah blah. And they even talk about it being a freedom issue.
You can also think about drugs and in relation to the comic books. Okay, so you have a problem with young people, juvenile delinquency, right? So now you say, well, what's causing juvenile delinquency? Right, so you do the whole logical thing. What are all the kids doing? Well, all the kids are reading comics.
Exactly, and that's
So
what Wortham did.
We didn't read, Wortham didn't read comics. They didn't have comics when they were kids. So this must be what's doing.
This is what's doing.
Well,
so that kids read comics, therefore they'll become delinquents. Kids breathe, therefore they'll become delinquents. I mean, it's really a logical fallacy, but that's where they focused on. That was the one thing that was common to.
And that's where I think I was going earlier when I lost my train of thought, is that the parents with this baby boomer generation and this youth culture that was just kind of starting to, have its own identity. Parents post-war were like, everything's perfect. Why are you acting out? Why do you have an attitude? Why are you being a teenager?
Why are you a rebel without a cause?
Why are you a rebel without a cause? And so they didn't understand why kids who had everything would feel or who had what they felt was everything because they came through the depression
Right.
would be so angsty, and so they would look and be like, what the hell is going on? This is right before rock and roll took off. So the only common factor, like Dan was saying, the thread that connected a lot of these cases was comic books, and that is what Frederick Wortham focused on. And there are videos and images that we hope to include in the documentary of him interviewing kids and asking, how does comic books make you feel, and blah blah blah. And he's asking these very leading questions. But it's interesting to see these kids talk to him about, and these are mostly pre-adolescent kids, who don't know any better.
So are these all white kids, or are there any black
they're not.
kids?
There are black kids.
Oh.
In fact, there are.
I think one.
Yeah,
That,
at least
that
one
wasn't
of them is
wasn't
black.
Wortham who did the interview.
No, it wasn't Wortham. Sorry,
but it was another guy who just
Yeah.
had an agenda and trying
Yes.
to make a name for himself. But yeah, one kid I think was African American.
But he had to
was
be
Hispanic.
Yeah.
So
But why all or nothing? Why completely get rid of them as opposed to like we do today, where there's ratings?
well, I think the hope was that the comics code would actually destroy the comic book.
Yeah, they
industry.
didn't care about preserving him because it wasn't seen as anything of any value on the.
So when did it become that?
when did it become?
Was he outright from? It doesn't sound like he was outright from the start wanting to
He-
destroy the comic book. He had a principle that this is causing harm.
Frederick
so
Wortham.
let's-
Yeah, Frederick Wortham
wasn't entirely against comic books, right?
Yeah, he wasn't entirely against comic books. His big thing was crime. Anything that had crime, and he'd get rid of crime. He saw comics like all comics for the most part were a weird aspect of crime or had some sort of psychosexual thing. Like Wonder Woman's a lesbian, and romance comics teach kids date rape, and they didn't have that term, but it's things like that. So he was seeing hobgoblins that weren't there, although some of the horror comics were pretty graphic. But why no rating? Because they just didn't see any value in it. Whereas Hollywood, they installed the Hays Code and, first for a while, and then eventually they did the rating system because they're like, well, people are demanding a little bit more, so let's give it to them, but we want to make people aware that this is an R-rated movie, blah, 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 blah. They have that now. They have ratings on some comics, but they're just doing it themselves. So it just was not seen as something that had any value. I think that's the biggest thing. It was something, and a lot of people just wanted.
And that comics were just for kids.
Right.
Yes.
And there
It
was
sounds
no.
like he didn't see them as being
A legitimate medium.
like a novel or whatever
Yeah.
that
There was no concept of them having any kind of value.
Of adults reading comics.
right.
Right. There was
because
no,
adults didn't generally want to admit that they read comics.
They read graphic novels.
Well,
Well,
right
they-
nowadays.
now they do.
but like
They
but,
didn't have that
but
term.
the
That's
GI
a euphemism for a comic.
the main people who read comics back then were GI veterans, because they enjoyed reading the comics of the superheroes, in the war, and then they came back, and then there was all this science fiction stuff, so they would, pick up
Yeah.
this more mature material.
It's a little easier in the trench to read a comic than it is.
My Uncle Wendell, who was, when I was a kid, he was still a teenager, so I guess he would be a kid. But he had a lot of the older, World War II military comics, and a lot of the,
Air fighters.
well, also the westerns. He had a whole bunch of the old Ghost Riders that I went, wow, that was heavy. But yeah, he had, that was pre-comic book code stuff that I was getting into. Whoa.
Right.
Well, and after the comics code was adopted, westerns took over, like in the 50s.
Really?
And yeah, oh yeah, westerns.
Oh.
And in fact, I think I can't recall the exact statistic, but I think it was by you know, the late 50s, like over 50% of the shows on TV were Western shows.
Right, and so it reflected that in the comics.
Yeah.
Lash LaRue, Hopalong Cassidy.
What happened after World War II is during the war, I mean, you had funny animal and kind of funny comics like Archie and things like that. But after the war, but what was really popular for the period of time in the late 30s to the end of the war was superhero comics. And somehow after the war ended, people started to get interested in other things, and they just all the comics slowly died except for Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman.
Well, the Allies won. You know, the evil had been vanquished.
Right,
you
and
know?
I think people were just, but just a second. But then new genres in comics, not new genres, but new genres in comics started opening. Which the big ones are science fiction, romance. Kirby and Simon, the guy who created Captain America, created the first romance comic. So romance comics, that got a lot of more girls into reading comics, although they were already reading comics, but they got them even more. Westerns, and then
crime and horror.
And then crime eventually morphed into horror.
That was this was the
pre-code. So this
from
there's
about
a lot of
1945 to 1950.
right. So there was a lot of 45 to like 52, 53. There's a lot of interesting, weird things going on in comics at that time.
This is during the war too, though.
No, this is all post-war.
Post-war.
Pre-war and pre-war was largely superheroes. Like
And kind of like funny animals. Funny things like that.
Yeah,
I
and
think
you had some residual pulp heroes.
Right.
So basically, like all the war comics were actually, targeted to the guys who had served, and they would read war comics.
To an extent. I mean, other people like work on. That's not to say there were westerns and there were some of these other things, but they just weren't
as popular.
They weren't
popular
as the superhero.
This period,
right? And like teenage stuff, like Archie.
So how did Casper the Friendly Ghost and those guys get through the censors
because they were completely under the radar. They were
just a funny cartoon
controversial.
Even though they were ghosts.
Yeah, I mean they were that was the thing about it, is they were
cutesy.
You present something in a cute package like the Donald Duck comics, and then maybe some ulterior messages right there. But I mean, you read a. I mean, I have some collections of some old Casper comics, and they're pretty innocuous. They're not like there isn't as much subtext. I mean, there is some.
It's basically a family of ghosts. Well, there's just a family wearing sheets.
Pretty lighthearted.
Pretty.
Wait,
that could go the wrong way.
maybe that's not what I meant.
Thanks, Dan.
This is not that kind of show.
I mean, and I think the other thing is which I didn't appreciate until I was much older, was with the skill with which those kind of Casper comics were made. They're actually really well done. They're really well drawn. They put a lot of talent. I think that Walter Kremer is the guy who drew most of that stuff, and he was an amazing talent. And I mean, he was kind of like the Osamu Tezuka of like kids comics, because everyone copied his style.
Isn't that how the comics got to Japan then, just through World War II?
I think there was an influence post-war. A lot of soldiers had stuff, and so I think they glommed onto the idea of that. But Japan also had some of its own traditions too. I forgot what they called it, but there were these guys who would illustrate these very detailed pictures, and then they would go to a park or a playground or something like that, and then they would tell these stories, and they'd move on to the next frame, and they talk the story, and then they had a picture that they would tell. And so comics in Japan also grew out of that tradition of these, what was it called? I can't remember. My wife told me the name. And that died out like in the 1960s.
But there was a traditional kind of painting scroll thing where you would tell a story visually all the way through.
Right, the Choju Giga. The Choju Giga were these scrolls, and some of them are just they're they almost look like they're Looney Tune characters or something like that. There's animals and monkeys and everything's running around having these fun things, and they're considered national treasures. In fact, when I went to Japan, I made a point of going to see them because I'm such a comic fan. I'm like, oh yeah, these are. So they had this tradition of illustrating scrolls in Japan. And granted, there's now panels and all this stuff like that, but so they hadn't, and they had the wood block prints. So in modern society, comics, fit in very well with kind of the
There
Japanese
was not a
aesthetic.
demonization of the image.
Right.
You
there
get
was
in the
no
Western tradition, especially Protestantism, is like,
a graven image. We can't have
Right.
that. There was none of that, and so there was a tradition of illustration and an artistry with something on the an illustrated image on the printed page. Where in the Western society we've been fighting. Well, American society we've been fighting that, and they've made peace with that
Well,
in Europe.
it's
They
either
don't have a
art-
problem with it in Europe. But comics in Europe, they're fine with it for the most part.
But America-
They've had some problems in Britain, but it's for similar reasons. But some comic book creator would commit a crime, and they're like, "See, we told you. They're all murderers and they're crazy."
Wait a minute, when was the last politician that committed a crime?
Right, exactly.
Oh, well, no,
They're all
nothing to see here.
nothing.
Move along.
Nothing. To
But
see.
there's evidence of the illustrated form of language and literature all the way back to the ancient world. Like the hieroglyphics on the
Writing
in
comes
Egypt.
from images.
Right.
Writing comes from Egypt. The Egyptians, and even further back in the prehistoric era where you've got freaking cave drawings.
Right.
So the illustrated language, before language, before words, there
was
were
the
pictures.
image. There was the image.
So it's really ironic that that we that society has demonized the image over the word, because even though the word came later, the image.
That's a long, bitter theological trail there, dude.
It is, and with something we could probably talk about for
yeah,
a
we
very
don't
long
want to
time.
go on there.
But I just wanted to make that point,
Right.
is that it's like we really have no right to demonize these images just because they're images telling a story, because that's actually what got us to this point. It's we have images to thank for language.
That's the other documentary, Comics: A Hidden History.
But let's talk. We've talked a lot about the pre-code and what happened during the code. How about what happened after the code and the results?
Bringing up to the point of
getting
the
up
code.
to the actual death of the code. So from the time that the code was instituted, what kind of was the timeline for the dark years, as we could call them, where censorship is at its height, and then progressing onward until the time that when the code kind of fizzled out.
Well, in the 1960s, Marvel came on, and superhero comics were king in mainstream comics. You did have war comics were still pretty popular, but they were well drawn. But if you go back and read an old Sergeant Rock comic from the 1960s, they couldn't show people being killed. So they just there'd be some bullets flying around, and then they'd throw a grenade, and then you'd see a helmet flying through the air from a German gun nest. It was it's actually fascinating through a point. Like, how do you tell a war story without anybody dying? And then you just kind of see people ducking, and then Sergeant Rock says something like, "Well, we didn't all make it." I'm like, "Well, we didn't show anybody not making it," but it was really interesting. It's like, how do you tell a war story without you just
Where's Bunny? Oh, he didn't make it.
he didn't make it. It was just
Right.
like they didn't. I mean, it was just like imagine Saving Private Ryan without showing anybody getting killed, just an explosion. But I mean, like, how would you? It was like Sergeant Rock was just sheer force of the coolness of that character is what it's like. And then finally
And the story.
well, not even the story. It was just Sergeant Rock, man. He was just so fucking cool. Because I mean, it was just like you have a war story where you can't show people dying. That's why when it comes to war comics, post Code, I kind of like the 70s because then they started people getting shot again and that kind of stuff. And
Well,
then,
and why was that though?
Well, why was
what
it?
happened?
What did happen? Do you want to tell the story?
Yeah, sure. And you can fill me in if I'm missing anything here. But basically, the impetus was this. I think what was it? 69? I think Stanley was approached by I forget which government agency, but
It might have been the DEA. I'm not
might
sure.
have been well, if the DA was around, it might have been the precursor to the DA or something.
right.
It was basically a public health agency, government public health agency came to him and Marvel Comics and said, "We'd like you to do. We noticed that your Spider-Man comic is really popular, and a lot of
With
the
the
kids
kids.
with the kids." And so we'd like you to, and this is late 60s, right? So, Summer of Love, LSD has just been, illegalized,
The Summer of Love was illegalized? What?
But like, so they came to him and said, "Can you do an anti-drug story for us?" And he said, "Sure." So he had this 3-issue story arc written and scripted. They sent the script in. I think they sent the script in to the Comics Code Authority, who immediately rejected it based upon the fact that it talked about drugs, even though it was an anti-drug story.
Yeah.
So Stan Lee and his publisher were like, "Well,
The federal
we're just-
government
we're-
wants
yeah.
us to do this.
So basically, Stan said, I've had enough of this. This is good for the kids. We're gonna publish it anyway," which was at the time like, "Oh my God,
His
are you
publisher
serious?"
and uncle, his name was Martin Goodman, and he sided with him and said, "Yeah, let's just do it."
Let's just do it. We won't put the code on it, and we'll just see what happens. And it was like, okay, nobody move. It was like a big hold your breath moment. For Comics Code.
Wow.
For comic books. So they published it, and nothing happened. It sold. Nobody, like
Did it get positive
People
reviews?
didn't go out,
people
commit rape and murder.
Yeah, like
Because
people didn't, throw themselves off of buildings, and the world
Or
didn't
start
collapse.
taking drugs because
Yeah.
the book said don't take drugs.
Right. So
And they didn't boycott.
after
Nobody boycotted, nobody cared.
So after this, and these 3 issues.
Let's boycott this anti-drug message.
Yeah.
What?
Well, no, the thing was like, well, we can't, after the fact, it was like, well, yeah, you guys are ridiculous. This is too stringent. This is too strict. You can't even mention drugs in a negative light. This is obviously past, its expiration date.
Stupid.
So they actually had they actually got together, the Comics Code Authority, and redrafted some of the
Loosen
guidelines
restrictions.
and loosen the restrictions on certain things as drug references and one of the main things that came out of that was loosening restrictions on drugs in a negative light, but also horror comics were allowed to eke back in a little bit, and so they started, you could mention things like werewolves again, and I don't know about vampires.
Vampire. You could talk about vampire. The really one funny one was zombies.
Zombies.
You couldn't use. You could have undead creatures,
Yeah.
but you couldn't use the term zombie.
Yes.
So they called them. So Marvel called them Zuvembis. I don't know if they Zuvembis. It was
Something
like
like that.
What is that, a Haitian word for
I-
zombie or something?
Probably,
No,
yeah,
it's some
exactly. It was
made-up
like
word,
ZUMIBES or something, Zuvembis or something.
Yeah.
So it was,
And that was okay.
and that was okay. And so that's why you started having like Dracula showing up in superhero comics and Werewolf by Night.
And they became immensely popular. Like the horror comics
But the
from the
kids were
70s.
going to the movies and watching all these guys
Exactly,
anyway.
exactly. And they've been going since.
The Hammer films. everything.
Since the stuff had been implemented. They've been going to these things, but for some reason it was so stupid. But even then, it was still really restrictive. But it loosened it up a little bit. People chilled out.
Mhm.
Maybe you could show that a man and a woman actually loved each other. And
Well, and one of the things.
What do you mean by that, Jenny?
we'll just give each other a hug.
It's like TV where you could never show. You know, it's always two
Yeah,
separate beds.
oh.
You know, there was no.
Bert and Ernie.
It was the twin bed lobby.
Right, exactly. Point 90.
2 beds for the price of.
But like we kind of skipped over like the introduction of transformation of Timely Comics into Marvel Comics and the post-code monster books that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee were doing. That actually it was like, so the nuclear age, the space age, right? You know,
They were called Acme at that time.
or Acme, sorry, and
They
then
were Timely, then Acme.
and then Acme, yeah. So Acme Comics, they were producing a lot of like, you know, because the superheroes hadn't come back into popularity yet. So post code, they're like, well, we've got a lot of romance and westerns, and let's throw some irradiated monsters in there, you know. And these are just hulking big creatures, you know,
Godzilla-like.
Godzilla-like creatures
Giant
with
monsters
these
were popular at
with
the
these funny names like Groot and
Groot?
Moomba
That's where Groot comes from.
and Moomba
Groot
and
comes from that
yes.
monster traditions before the Marvel Age of Super.
yeah, and even and even the Hulk. You know, there was a creature called the Hulk before the Incredible Hulk.
Kind of
Yeah, and so then those books were like in the early '60s, right?
late 50s or
Early '60s, and then Stan Lee was getting very disillusioned with comic books. You know, he didn't really want to continue. But his wife told him, why don't you, before you quit, why don't you do a comic book based on like what you want to do? Like what would be cool to you? You know,
What would
give
be
it
fun?
one last shot. What would be fun? And Stan Lee came up with the idea for the Fantastic Four, and which was a science fiction based
adventure story.
And it had a monster guy.
on the first it did, but on the first issue there's this giant monster coming out of the ground, you know, that's very Kirby-esque in that sense, and these little people, human-sized superheroes,
not wearing any costumes, by the way.
fighting this thing. And that actually that book, and along with Amazing Fantasy 15, the introduction of Spider-Man, which was the reason it was issue 15 was because all the previous issues were monster books. So that he started this like last-ditch effort with this one hero that him and Steve Ditko came up with called Spider-Man.
And his publisher, his uncle, hated it.
Yeah.
Spiders?
Yeah.
Oh,
Nobody-
people hate spiders. Why would you want to do something about that?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then when the sales came back, 3 months later, the sales figures, like Martin Goodman went to Stan Lee and said, hey, you know that Spider-Man character that we both like so much? Why don't we make that into a regular comic?
Well, it wasn't it? So it was 3 months later that Spider-Man 1 came out. I mean, immediately, I thought it was the next month, but it was an immediate hit. It was an immediate hit.
There was a gap. Yeah.
They were like, okay, this guy's getting his own title. So that was Spider-Man's first appearance was Amazing Fantasy 15, and from that point on, he had his own title, and he was one of the first, what's called the Silver Age of comic books. He was the first, well, aside maybe from the Flash, first Marvel comic book superhero to get his own title in a comic book, I think. And everybody knows Spider-Man now, you know, so that's how successful that turned out to be.
Yeah, on the Marvel side of the house.
On the Marvel side of things.
DC's story is a little more complicated.
It is a little more complicated. But the Marvel comics essentially is credited with bringing back the superhero into the limelight with the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and books that followed, such as the Hulk, the X-Men, and the Avengers,
And it had all
and
of that.
Iron Man.
Yeah, and it had all that angst that
Yeah.
the kids like so much.
Yeah. The thing that Stan Lee really was able to tap
Relate
into
to.
was
Right.
yeah, like the DC heroes, you know, for all their greatness, they were these loftier than life people, you know. They were these
God.
they were essentially gods, you know. Even Batman, who was like just a normal guy, was like greater and smarter and better at everything than you could ever
And he was
possibly
like your
hope
dad.
to be. Yeah, he was. And
You were Robin,
but what
the
Stan Lee,
sidekick, and he was your dad.
where Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and a lot of those guys succeeded at with Marvel was creating superheroes that people could relate to.
Yeah.
Like Spider-Man, who was a teenager, a nerdy teenager who had angst and like problems, and like responsibilities and these really
that he was failing at.
these feelings and failings and successes and
Well,
romances.
look at the Hulk. I mean, the Incredible Hulk is a teenager, right?
No,
he's not.
No. I'm saying that
Oh,
you can
right.
archetypally, a guy reading that is a.
That's
Don't
why
make
the
me
appeal
angry.
became- Don't make
You won't like me if I'm angry.
Right. Yeah. Stan Lee was able to tie. He was able
that's
to
a
tie
connection.
tie these connections into these
Emotionally.
characters, infuse them, especially the Fantastic Four, with like who's essentially a family. There's siblings. And there's a little bit of a love triangle going on in there, and they work together, they
Bickering and-
fight, they love each other, but it's very dynamic.
How
and-
like life.
How like life, right? And that's one of the things that helped Marvel Comics propel themselves to the forefront of what's called the Silver Age of comics.
Right. They eventually, towards the end of the 60s, they started beating DC Comics and Superman and Wonder Woman and all that, which was unheard of at the time. They were like, oh my gosh. But the DC Comics were also pretty much, I don't want to say straightforward, but they were, but I'm going to say that. They were straightforward superhero adventure stories.
Yes.
And the Marvel Comics were, they were an emotional journey for the character. There was an emotional journey. You were getting inside the characters' heads.
The character-driven versus
Character-driven.
story-driven.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. So the DC Comics were story-driven, and where's the next attack happening? Where's the next threat to society? How can I solve this conundrum? Where Spider-Man's like, oh my gosh, I had to fight the Green Goblin, and now I
gotta do my homework, and then I've gotta turn in my pictures for my newspaper job.
One of the greatest moments in the Silver Age of comics has nothing to do with the superhero battle at all. A superhero fight. It's in a superhero comics. I don't remember the exact issue, but it's the first appearance of Mary Jane Watson. In the comics, for several years, I think, Aunt May's friend kept talking about, oh, I have this wonderful girl, her name's Mary Jane, and you should meet her. Maybe you should go on a date. And and Peter's like, oh, I bet she's not very good looking. And he's always avoiding it, and always avoiding it, and always avoiding it. And then finally, he's always something happens. Him being Spider-Man, he's always able to not show up. And then finally, something happens where he happens to be at home, and it's like, oh, I've asked Mary Jane over, and we're going to set you up in this date. And he's just like, oh. And then the doorbell rings, and he's like, okay. And he goes to the door and opens the door, and the final page of that comic, she's standing there, and she's fucking gorgeous, and she says, you just hit the jackpot, Tiger. And he's now jaws open. He's like, just Google it.
She said that?
She said that.
Yeah, she did. That's verbatim.
Oh my God.
Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot.
Yeah.
And she's standing there, and she's
Wow.
like, she looks like she's walked out of a really well-drawn romance comic from across the street. She looks like she came from a completely different genre of comics, and there she is standing there. And it just blew people away. And he planned that for months, if not years. I can't remember how long
she started. This was an Amazing Spider-Man, and she had been mentioned, in some previous issues, and then
A running
and
gag.
then slowly
It was a running gag.
and then slowly, eventually, like he said, it builds up to this great reveal. Well, who's Mary Jane? Well, here she is, and it's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And they're like, this beautiful, gorgeous woman is now a main character in a superhero story, and she's not a superhero. Wow,
Right.
it's like Lois Lane in a sense, but Lois Lane was, she was the girl next door, the reporter. Mary Jane is like the TV actress who's like, who is one of the only people who knows that Spider-Man is Spider-Man.
Well, not at that time.
Not at that time.
That came later in the 80s.
Yeah.
But
But what? She's doing her aunt or whoever a favor by taking out this nerd? Is
Right,
that the
exactly.
idea?
Yeah, exactly. Here Peter was like avoiding her this whole time because he thought he was going to be like, and then he's the one who's like, whoa.
Yeah.
And then he had another girl he was already pursuing, which was
Gwen Stacy.
Stacy. So it creates this love triangle, and she's from a different high school, and so it brings in all of this
Romance comic stuff.
romance comic stuff, but it's in a and that's my friends. This is the secret. I will let you in. Everyone thinks superhero comics are a genre, but actually, superhero comics and superhero stories are actually a super genre. It is a genre that encompasses all other genres. It just has a flavoring of superhero-ness on top. You can tell a space opera story, a romance story, a western,
A war story.
a time travel story, a war story, and but all these things can, a crime procedural story or something like that.
It's almost just like fiction versus nonfiction. It's like it's its own mega genre.
Right, it encompasses everything else. It's just that's what to tie it to something that's current, like the Russo brothers who are making Marvel films now, they get that. They're like, oh, like the Winter Soldier, like we can tell a kind of a thriller, a 1970s style thriller, but tell it with superheroes and just add some superhero goodness over the top, or or the current Captain America Civil War story. We can tell this kind of this tragedy about these relationships between people and stuff like that. So that's kind of an aside. That doesn't have to do with the comics stuff.
So,
but anyway,
but after
How much did they pay you for that plug?
I got $20.